She used her fingers. There's Senator Kirsten Gillibrand in South Carolina eating the local fried chicken with her fingers after she asked the woman in the striped shirt sitting beside her, who owns the restaurant, whether she should use her fork or her fingers. And Twitter went wild when CNN political reporter Jasmine Wright delivered that moment in a finely observed series of tweets about Senator Gillibrand's campaign stop in South Carolina. In one of those tweets, Jasmine Wright delivered an overheard, completely human moment when Senator Gillibrand asked the owner of the restaurant, Kiki, do we use our fingers or forks for the chicken? Kiki said, use her fingers, and use her fingers she did. No one cared about the tweet before that. Quote, citing how more black women die from childbirth than other races, she said, I will take on institutional racism. I will take it head on. The important thing for too many political observers was that Senator Gillibrand had failed a local eating test on the campaign trail. They did that to John Kerry in 2004 in Philadelphia, where he got his cheesesteak order terribly wrong by asking for Swiss cheese. Who would do that? The news media felt they had the proof right there that John Kerry was not a real man of the people, or at least not a real man of the people of Philadelphia, or at least not a real man of that subset of the people of Philadelphia who wolfed down cheesesteaks at Pat's Cheesesteak, a ritual stop for presidential campaigners. When Twitter got up in arms about Senator Gillibrand even thinking about using a fork for her fried chicken, Sam Stein tweeted this photograph of Donald Trump ready to use his knife and fork on a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Donald Trump was doing that on his private plane. A private plane kind of proves that Donald Trump is not a man of the people. But Donald Trump's voters wisely did not care about that. And anti-Trump voters didn't care about it either. No one voted against Donald Trump because he uses a fork to eat a bucket of fried chicken. But the news media will continue to pretend that this stuff matters. It is a habit that they just cannot kick. Matthew Iglesias of Fox, with whom I cannot remember the last time I disagreed, observed that this kind of authenticity test is something that the news media takes much more seriously with Democratic candidates than Republican candidates. Every Democratic nominee is inevitably put through a series of authenticity tests that Republicans are exempted from because it's in the interests of the rich people who run the media to sideline the substantive stakes in American politics. Yes. That is what happens, but no, that's not why that happens. The rich people who run the media could not care less about cheesesteak or fried chicken. It's the reporters and pundits themselves who are making these choices to emphasize these things and try to infuse them with some larger meaning that somehow tells you something important about what this person will do as president of the United States. It is much easier to do that than ask a smart question about the Trump tariffs or foreign policy or tax policy. It's political reporters themselves and the political pundits themselves who, as Matthew Iglesias puts it, sideline the substantive stakes in American politics. They are going to continue to do that, and it is your job to continue to ignore it. That's why every presidential candidate interview we have done on this program has been exclusively about what policies that candidate will pursue and support as president. Every candidate interview here will be about the substantive stakes in the presidential election. That's what every voter should be focused on. But don't expect the political news media to make that easy for you. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.